This lecture is going to be about critical incident stress debriefing, CISD. That's how most people refer to it by its acronym. Technically, there are a couple types of critical incident stress debriefing. Uh, they have a process for individuals and they have a process for groups. I've primarily worked with groups uh, because most of the critical incident stress debriefings in which I participated have been with the Red Cross. Um, so most of those, very few people respond as individuals with the Red Cross. We normally respond uh, with partners or a group of people. Another thing I want to say is that I'm going to go over in a different lecture psychological first aid. It's a little more comprehensive. Critical incident stress debriefing is a part of that larger concept of psychological first aid. It is one part of that bigger picture. And I think that some people may want to use critical incident stress debriefing um, for individuals who have directly experienced a trauma. However, I personally believe that those individuals need more in-depth psychological first aid and more individual attention than CISD offers. And this is my personal opinion, I believe critical incident stress debriefing works the best, and it works really well with individuals who experience secondary uh, trauma, or some people might call it responder trauma. There's a lot of different names for it, but it's when there's been crisis, people have experienced trauma or traumatic event, um, and or at least been in this crisis. Maybe we don't know if it's ended up in trauma or not, but many of the first responders, the responders to that event, they weren't directly victims, but they were responders to the crisis. This could include people in the military, people who fight fires, police, Red Cross volunteers, nurses, doctors, a broad range of responders. So I think it works best with responders who go to a crisis to help in some way. I'd like to share some personal examples and experiences of my own with you, both as a responder and somebody who has processed experiences using CISD with other groups. One of the things that I'd like to mention is why I believe critical incident stress debriefing is so helpful. So let's say a responder, first responder goes to a crisis, and they help in any way they can. They've observed the negative results of that crisis. Perhaps people died or were injured, or whatever it might be, the result. But if they simply left and went home, that experience may result in trauma. That experience to the crisis might result in some trauma. But if it is processed appropriately with critical incident stress debriefing, I personally believe that it is very helpful in avoiding resulting trauma. They are more resilient to that crisis because it has been processed. Now, I did provide an article by one of the individuals, Mitchell, who really was one of the forerunners and creators of CISD. And you please read that article. But in the article, it says between 24 and 72 hours within that time period, we should process with critical incident stress debriefing. And my personal experience is that I'd like to try to do this within 24 hours. It doesn't have to be immediately following the crisis. Like if people respond to maybe an apartment building that was on fire, and it's midnight, we don't have to keep them after working in that crisis to process it immediately after. We can process it within 24 hours, but I would try not to wait longer than that. It says you can wait up to 72, but I believe that the sooner we can process it, the better effect, more positive results that we'll see. So some of the times that I have used critical incident stress debriefing was, I work with the Red Cross as part of their licensed professional counselors or therapists or psychologists, their mental health team. And I work on both the local and national level. And I've done a lot of different mission work using my counseling skills internationally, but never with the Red Cross internationally, only nationally and locally. So sometimes I am not at the scene of the crisis, and I'm called upon the next day, perhaps, to schedule a time when we can process the experience with the responders. And it could be anything from Red Cross workers to police to people who work for the fire department, to people who work on ambulances, emergency medical. But whoever it might be, whoever responded, we definitely offer this too. And just some examples, in the winter, there are more house fires, more apartment fires. That seems to go up quite a bit in the winter because of different types of heaters that people use, either open grade electric with heating elements that might touch fabrics or something like that, or some of the more dangerous ones are propane heaters. So there are more fires in the colder months. And sometimes it's multiple units, like in an apartment building. So a lot of people might be involved. When we talk about running groups, the article, I believe, says that you can go up to about 20 people in a group. I try to just get more Red Cross volunteers, and I use smaller groups. I think the ideal size of a group for this would be about 10 to 12. So I try not to have really large groups, but you know, there's nothing wrong with having a larger group. I just like to work with smaller groups. So other incidences are working with the military, working with police officers. Perhaps there was, a violent incident. Perhaps there was a large car or truck accident that involved many casualties. So Red Cross volunteers who responded to a crisis, floods, lots of floods in the fall and the spring, and especially hurricanes even. Other areas might have tornadoes. I've never responded to a tornado before, but you get the idea. And then there were many times when I responded to the crisis, and then afterward, I processed my experience with in a group. I was in the group because I was one of the responders. I think the most difficult times are any time that there are victims who die unexpectedly. I think, human loss is probably the most difficult thing to deal with, loss of life. And usually the most senseless bring up the most existential questions or feelings. So I think that shootings fall into that category. I understand the abnormal psychology and theory that is involved in those incidents, but it doesn't really make it that easier to deal with, because we're still dealing with human lives that were lost that did not need to be lost. So one time, I think the first shooting I responded to was a while ago now, the LA Fitness shooting in Pittsburgh. I did not go to the scene of that, but I sat in the emergency room with the immediate family members as the victims were in the operating room, and worked with them. And later we were able to see the victims, but it was mainly working with the families of and loved ones of the victims after that shooting. And then the Tree of Life in Squirrel Hill. I really had a connection with that synagogue because I used to live about 2 houses down from it. So I walked past it every day. I said, hello to my neighbors. And but I had moved away for, I don't know, about 15 years. But I was familiar with the area. And the that was a more poignant experience because we did go directly to the area, which was the Jewish center in Squirrel Hill, and we did sit with people who had been there when the shooting took place. Of course, anybody who was injured was at the hospital, but and we were asked to do many many different roles in that situation. A broad range of things were needed during that emergency, and so I did everything from talk to victims or people who had been there, who were uninjured, but who had experienced that trauma. And I also sat with family members. But they also asked me to do other things because, they needed a lot of people. So after I kind of did my Red Cross mental health duties, I was there for an extended period of time, and they needed somebody to watch the door because sometimes when these things happen, a lot of different people come to the crisis area who shouldn't really be there. Some of them have good intentions, but we don't know the intentions of all the people. And so this center had multiple entrances, and they had to keep certain entrances open. They couldn't lock all of the entrance. They had to have at least 2 open. So they asked me to stand at the garage entrance, and only people who either had some type of official identification, like FBI or CIA or police or doctors or something like that, or if they were a relative, an immediate family member of somebody who was at that center or a victim who had been harmed. Those were the only people who were allowed in. There were also some political figures who wanted to be there. I'm not sure whether that was really appropriate or not. But also whatever political figure, senators, governors, representatives, they pulled up their limos or cars to the underground garage, and I had to screen them. But many individuals wanted access to that building and population who were not supposed to be there, and who could have posed some sort of danger. And of course, there were other scenarios, other crises like fires and floods that I participated in as well. I do believe that processing this after the experience was extremely helpful to me and everybody else. I believe that So I really do have confidence in this method, even though it seems a very simple process. So I would like to talk about the process a little bit. Well, I'll go through the entire process with you. And um, so, you know, one of the things is that the group of individuals that is in the critical incident stress debriefing group, they all needed to experience or be a part of the same crisis. They could have been doing different things responding to that crisis. For instance, you might have had fire personnel and police and things like that, but they were all responders to that same crisis. So that's considered a homogeneous group. Everybody was at the same crisis, responding to the same crisis. So it's not a heterogeneous group. And who's ever there should not be currently involved in the crisis. The crisis is most likely over, or if it's continuing, it's been passed on. Their duties have been passed on to other volunteers or personnel. And most of the individuals in the group should have similar levels of exposure to that experience. And it says that, and this is important. And this is why I say, well, it doesn't have to be immediately after the crisis, because a lot of times individuals are so tired and drained after working in one of these crises that they're exhausted. So it can be, I would say within 24 hours. They say within 72 hours or something like that. So I think, there's 7 phases to the critical incident stress debriefing. And they sound very simple and straightforward, but each one is pretty important, and they put them in kind of an order that has to be followed, because they gradually build up to basically an expression of emotion or an affective place, and then they move to a more cognitive. So it kind of is like a curve. So it is important that you do have a licensed professional leading this, because some people may experience more emotions and a more emotional response to this, and it's good to have somebody who's trained in dealing with that. So the first part of any group is kind of an introduction to the group. It's important that it's not a mystery. People know what the group is for, how it's going to help them, and really this is to process their experience of a crisis to avoid long-term trauma, so that they can become more resilient and move on with their lives. I do say that, I think that every experience affects our lives in some way, but we don't want these experiences to be a detriment to our daily functioning or our emotional well-being. It's not like we're going to forget these experiences, but we don't want them to negatively affect how we function on a daily basis or our emotional health and well-being. So we kind of set the tone to the session with this introduction to what critical incident stress debriefing is. I would say at least half of the individuals I work with in a group have gone through this before, and perhaps half or less are new. So many times people are used to this process. The second phase of CISD keeps it at a fairly cognitive level, and it's really the factual phase, and we're easing the group into this process. So it's a lot easier to deal with emotions when we're talking about the facts of a situation. So I usually ask individuals to share the facts or a thumbnail of what the situation of what happened, and like an overview of what happened. They don't have to talk for long. We do go around the circle, but nobody has to participate if they're not feeling up to it. Sometimes it's hard to participate. So I do explain the benefits of participation and the benefits of talking about an experience are it gives individuals the opportunity and a greater ability to avoid dwelling on this experience in a negative way, or it helps them to avoid future trauma or PTSD. So this is kind of not a very detailed story, but anybody can share kind of that overview, that factual overview of what happened. And everybody has a different perspective. People participated in different ways. So we do see the experience from the eyes of multiple people, or from the experiences of multiple individuals. When I begin phase 2, even though it's factual, it is important to use basically all of our Rogerian person-centered skills to begin building that trust, to be present for them, to use, to be authentic and present and congruent, to be non-judgmental and empathic, to use reflection and paraphrase and clarification, and later summarization. So I really do rely on person-centered therapy and all of the skills and techniques beginning with these phases. Phase 2. Phase 3 is called the thoughts phase, and it's beginning the transition from that factual cognitive phrase to a more feeling or affective phase. And so we usually ask a question about what's your first thought or your most prominent thought, about what you experienced. And we always give them the option of remaining silent if they want. And this is usually the last time I go around in the circle. After the thoughts phase 3, then it's more whoever wants to volunteer, but expressing the thoughts about the factual situation is the transitional phase to the feeling phase. And phase 4 is our reaction phase. And this is probably the longest part of the critical incident stress debriefing, and probably the most intense or important part. Because this is where, we ask basically how they're reacting emotionally. We can add, there are prompting questions like, what's the worst thing about this event for you personally? Maybe they had a personal interaction with a victim, or maybe they were with someone when they passed away or suffered before they went to the hospital. You know, there's lots of possibilities, and these experiences touch every individual differently. Everybody reacts differently. But there's usually some form of emotional reaction, and this moves them into that emotional phase. So after we begin processing, after we process their emotional states, the next question is, okay, what do we do with this? And phase 5 is called symptoms. And the first thing I want to do is, with the emotions, I always reflect and use those Rogerian skills. Let them know that I'm there, I'm present, I've heard what they've shared, and I'm doing my best to empathize with them. So I do use reflection and paraphrase, especially in phase 4, the reaction phase. And then phase 5, what do we do with all this? Well, even though some of these crises that individuals respond to are horrors, like nightmare, fuel, we don't want them to hold on and get stuck in those emotions. And so the first thing we do is try to explain the symptoms that, it's normal for everybody to experience these emotions, and their emotions are valid. And, I might mention some of the common emotions that people have expressed, and that's called linking. And linking people's experiences that are similar or shared creates universality, and it lets them know that they are not alone in their emotional response to an experience. And I think that a lot of the individuals are probably experiencing not only emotion reactions, but physical reactions as well, or symptomology. So, we can look at their cognitive reaction, their emotional reaction, their physical reaction. Maybe their stomachs are upset, maybe they're not hungry, maybe they're feeling anxious, maybe they're shaking a little, maybe they're exhausted. There may also be some behavioral symptoms. Maybe they're more irritable now. Maybe they're expressing sadness, whatever it might be. And we also share a list of what some of the symptomology might be common, and maybe people don't realize that what they're experiencing physically is a result of the stress that they experienced in the crisis. So the last thing, well, there's two, but phase 6, teaching. So we talk about all the symptoms that they bring up. We explain a lot of it as much as we can. We universalize it. We see if they have any questions or want to share any symptomology. It's also kind of a time for screening to see if any individual might need more attention after the critical incident stress debriefing. Sometimes people need more than CISD. So this is kind of where we figure out, well, does somebody need to talk to maybe a therapist about this in more depth? So if the symptoms that they're experiencing are more severe. And phase 7 is the reentry stage. They can ask final questions or make final statements. We summarize what's been discussed. We give final information. And we always, give some contacts if somebody needs more help. We usually have handouts, and we give everybody handouts, and they always have a contact number on them. They could also contact the Red Cross, and we can refer them. And so those are the 7 phases. But the process isn't fully over, because usually in another 24 to 48 hours, we try to get back with them. And, so the next day or the day after the CISD group, we call them and we ask them, okay, it's been a couple days. How are you doing now? So I think that, I think that follow-up is important. In the article, it talks about, like having refreshments immediately after and having a little more informal gathering afterward, so that people can talk on their own and meet everybody. I think that's positive too. But I also think it's important to follow up and give each person a phone call a day or two following the CISD group. So that's pretty much the essence of CISD. It's very straightforward, but each component is important, and you have to use all of your counseling skills as you process this with the individuals. It's not a time for therapy, though. If we think people need more attention, it's important to make contact with somebody who can help them in more depth. So we're not going to provide therapy, but we are going to process their experience. All right, and we can talk about this if you have any questions in class, or you can ask in your next discussion board next week. We don't have one this week, but yeah. All right, thanks a lot.